The worst financial decision I ever made wasn't losing money. It was making it, and still feeling nothing. There I was, net worth climbing, every metric saying I'd won. And I remember sitting in a room I'd paid too much for, staring at numbers I'd worked myself half dead to reach, and feeling a silence so deep it scared me more than any loss ever had. Money was supposed to be the answer. That's what I'd been running toward. Not just comfort, freedom. The kind of freedom where fear no longer owns you, where you don't have to ask permission from anyone, where the morning belongs to you and not to a clock. But here's what nobody tells you about hard money lessons. The most brutal ones aren't about the markets. They're about what you discover about yourself when the markets strip you clean. You see, I didn't fear losing money. I feared what I would become if I kept making it the wrong way. And that distinction, most people never get close enough to the edge to feel it. Have you ever chased something so hard, for so long, that by the time you caught it, you couldn't remember why you wanted it in the first place? There's a version of financial freedom that looks exactly like a cage. You build it yourself, bar by bar, spreadsheet by spreadsheet, sacrifice by sacrifice. And one day you look up and realize the door is locked from the inside. I was that man. And what I learned next changed how I thought about money, fear, and what it actually means to be free. But not in the way you'd expect. There's a particular kind of silence that only comes after you've crossed the finish line. Not the silence of peace. Not the silence of relief. It's the silence of realizing the crowd you were running for was never really there. And the person you wanted to impress most can't be found anywhere in the room. I remember the exact night. Late. The kind of late where the city outside your window has finally stopped pretending to be alive. I was looking at a screen. The numbers were good. Better than good. The kind of numbers that younger men dream about in apartments with leaking ceilings and overdue rent. I had achieved what I set out to achieve. And I felt nothing. Worse than nothing. I felt the particular cold of a man who has just realized he's been solving the wrong equation for years. Let me tell you something uncomfortable about ambition. It doesn't actually care about your happiness. Ambition is a brilliant navigator with no interest in the destination. It just needs a direction, any direction. And it will drive you there with ruthless efficiency. But when you arrive, ambition has already moved on, already scanning the horizon for the next summit. And you're left standing in a room you designed entirely for someone else's approval. Was it my father's voice I was trying to silence? The uncle who said I'd never make it? The version of myself that believed them? I honestly don't know anymore. What I know is this. I spent the first decade of building wealth trying to become someone who couldn't be hurt. And in that obsession, I became someone who couldn't be reached. Here's what success does to you that no one warns you about. It doesn't make you stronger. It makes you more efficient at avoiding the questions that would make you human again. You get better at the game precisely because you stop asking whether the game is worth playing. I had friends, or people I called friends. But somewhere along the way, the relationships had turned into transactions. Not on purpose, just gradually. The way water carves stone, not one violent blow, but 10,000 quiet moments where connection gave way to convenience, where vulnerability gave way to positioning, where truth gave way to strategy. Think about it. When you're chasing it, you're too busy to feel. When you're protecting it, you're too anxious to be present. When you're growing it, you're too focused to be honest. Money doesn't just buy things, it buys distraction with extraordinary precision. What are you using your financial goals to avoid feeling right now? Because the morning I stared at those numbers and felt nothing wasn't a crisis, it was a diagnosis. My whole system, the discipline, the sacrifice, the relentless forward motion, had been running perfectly in service of a wound I had never actually treated. I had made money a religion. Not because I believed in money, but because belief required a more terrifying kind of courage. Belief required me to say, I want something. Not strategically, not safely, actually want it. In the way that makes you vulnerable. In the way that means the answer can be no. And for a man like me, built on control, built on certainty, built on the armor of competence, wanting something that vulnerably felt like standing naked in a field during a storm. Here's the thing nobody talks about when they talk about financial success. The scoreboard changes you before you can change the scoreboard. Every milestone you hit rewires how you see yourself. And if you're not careful, if you're not brutally, uncomfortably honest with yourself, you will wake up one day fully qualified to live a life you never actually chose. I had the freedom to go anywhere. I had no idea where I wanted to be. That night, I didn't make any dramatic decisions. I didn't quit anything or call anyone. I just sat with the silence longer than I ever had before. And in that silence, something had started to fracture. Not in a breaking way, but in the way that light gets in. What I hadn't yet understood was that the fracture wasn't the problem. The fracture was the beginning of something I couldn't name yet, couldn't hold, couldn't quantify. Something that all my wealth and all my discipline had never prepared me for. And the most unsettling part, I sensed for the first time that it might be the most important thing I'd ever face. Everyone who grows up without money has a fantasy. Not about being rich, about being free. Those are not the same thing. But for a long time, you can't tell the difference. When you're 17, eating the same meal 3 nights in a row because there's no other choice. When your options are limited not by your imagination but by your bank balance, freedom and wealth become the same word. They fuse together in your mind the way 2 wires fuse when the current gets too hot. Inseparable. Indistinguishable. I built my entire life on that fusion. Every early morning, every declined invitation, every relationship I kept at arm's length because I couldn't afford the distraction, all of it was in service of one future. The day I would be free. But here is the lie embedded at the core of that fantasy. The lie I wish someone had told me before I spent 15 years chasing it. Freedom is not a destination. It is not a number. It is not a notification on your phone telling you that your portfolio crossed some threshold and now you may begin living. Freedom is a relationship with yourself. And you cannot buy your way into it. I knew a man, who had more money than I have ever had. Generational wealth. The kind that makes ordinary rich people look middle class. And he was one of the most imprisoned human beings I have ever encountered. Not by circumstance. By himself. By a story he told about who he had to be, who was watching, what was expected. The money hadn't freed him. It had given him a more elaborate set of chains to carry. Here's the uncomfortable truth I need you to sit with. The version of freedom you're chasing might be a version you designed at your most afraid. Think about when you first decided what financial freedom meant to you. How old were you? What were you running from? Because most of us don't design our goals from a place of clarity, we design them from a place of wound. And then we spend decades executing on someone else's emergency. I remember the first time I actually had what I thought was freedom. The accounts were healthy. The obligations were manageable. The options were genuinely open. I booked a trip, somewhere I'd always wanted to go. And I sat in my hotel room, first morning, sun coming through curtains the color of cream. And I felt, not joy, anxiety. A low, persistent hum of wrongness. Like I was getting away with something I hadn't earned. Like the stillness was a trap, and any moment something would demand I justify my presence in it. That is not freedom. That is wealth, with the psychology of poverty still running underneath. Because wealth is an external condition. Poverty, real poverty, is an internal architecture. And you don't dismantle it by crossing a financial threshold. You dismantle it by going back into the rooms inside yourself you've been paying rent to avoid. I had never done that work. I had run hard and fast and far from those rooms. I had renovated the exterior of my life into something magnificent. Inside, in the places no portfolio statement could reach, I was still the boy who didn't have enough, who wasn't enough, who needed to prove something to someone who was no longer even paying attention. The market, this is the part that will sound strange, was more honest with me than I had ever been with myself. Because the market does not care about your story. It does not reward you for effort. It does not console you for sacrifice. It simply reflects reality, brutal and clear, the way only truly indifferent things can. And when I finally lost, really lost, the kind of loss that strips you of the comfortable fiction that you control more than you do, what I discovered in that loss was more valuable than anything I'd made before it. I discovered I was still here. The losing didn't kill me. And that knowledge, that specific knowledge, felt not thought, cellular not intellectual, began to undo the fear that had been running the whole operation from the beginning. Because the real currency I had been trading in, all along, was not dollars. It was certainty. The illusion of certainty. The story that if I could just accumulate enough, control enough, predict enough, I would finally be safe. But here is what the myth of freedom never tells you. Safe from what, exactly? That question has no clean answer, and perhaps that's the point. The question itself is the beginning of something. A different kind of accounting, a different kind of ledger. One where the most important assets have no market price at all. I was only beginning to understand what that meant. And the next loss would teach me in a way I was absolutely not prepared for. Every investor has a number they never tell anyone. Not the number in their account. The number in their chest. The number at which they believe they would break. The threshold they've been quietly, unconsciously calculating ever since they first put real money into something real. The loss that they're convinced would not just take their capital, but take something deeper. Something they can't recover. I had that number. I never said it out loud. I didn't have to. It lived in me the way an old injury lives in a joint, dormant, ignorable on good days, then suddenly, undeniably present when the weather changes. The weather changed. It didn't happen in a single day, although the worst of it compressed into a morning. It happened over months, the slow bleeding that markets do when they turn against a position you've built too much of your identity around. Each percentage down is not just a percentage, it is a question. A quiet, ruthless question. Who are you when this is gone? 6 a.m. phone face down on the nightstand because I already knew what it would say if I turned it over. Gray light through the window. The particular quality of silence that comes right before you stop pretending. I lay there for 11 minutes. I know because I counted. Just breathing. Not meditating. Not strategizing. Just existing in the last few seconds before I had to become a person who had to deal with the reality on that phone. When I turned it over, it was worse than I'd calculated. Not by much. But enough. And here is what I discovered in the hours that followed. The discovery that no market analysis, no financial education, no book on investing had ever prepared me for. I did not collapse. The number I had been afraid of arrived. And I was still standing. Still breathing. Still capable of making a cup of coffee. Still capable of calling someone I trusted. Still capable of thinking clearly enough to understand what had happened and what needed to happen next. The fear was not the truth. The fear was a story I had been telling myself about a moment that, when it actually arrived, was survivable. This is the thing that markets strip away, and it is a gift even though it doesn't feel like one. They strip away the illusion of your own fragility. The elaborate protection you've built around your sense of self. The diversification strategies that are really diversification from feeling. The hedge positions that are really about hedging against vulnerability. The market, when it decides to move, removes all of it. And what's left is just you. Not the financial you. Not the net worth you. The actual, unmistakable, undeniable you. And that person, I need you to really hear this, that person is more resilient than you have given them credit for. You've been managing your life around a collapse that, if it actually came, you would survive. I know this because humans are catastrophically bad at predicting their own emotional futures. We consistently overestimate how broken we'll be by the bad things, and underestimate how quickly we recover. The psychological term is impact bias. But in the context of money and fear, it means something deeply personal. The loss you've been running from is not as powerful as the running itself. The running is where the real damage happens. Every decision you make from fear compounds the fear. Every choice designed to protect you from a feeling confirms that the feeling is worth protecting against. Until your entire financial life becomes a monument to something you were afraid of 20 years ago and haven't examined since. What is your financial strategy actually protecting? Take a moment with that. Don't answer quickly. Because the glib answer, my family, my future, my freedom, those are real. But underneath them, if you go deep enough, if you're honest enough, there is usually something else. Something smaller. Something more specific. A memory, a moment, a version of you that felt powerless in a way you decided you would never feel again. The market doesn't care about that story. The market will test it anyway. Not to punish you, the market has no interest in you at all, which is itself an important realization, but simply because that is what markets do. They move. And in moving, they reveal. What mine revealed to me, in that gray morning with the phone face up on the bed, was not failure. It was inventory. A precise, unflattering, absolutely accurate inventory of what I had built my confidence on, and which parts of that foundation were actually solid. Some of it was. More of it wasn't. And the parts that weren't solid, I was going to have to rebuild. Not with money, with something I'd been actively avoiding for years. Nobody tells you that the cage is your own design. That's the part that makes it so hard to name. When someone else locks you in, there's clarity, there's an oppressor, a victim, a story with a villain. But when you've built the cage yourself, brick by careful brick, optimized and reinforced over years, following what felt like wisdom at every step, the story loses its villain. And you're left with something much harder to face, the recognition that everything constraining you was constructed by your own hands. I built mine over a decade. It looked extraordinary from the outside. The discipline. God, the discipline was real. The kind that other people admire from a distance and mistake for freedom. Early hours. Clear priorities. The ability to say no to opportunities, to people, to versions of myself that wanted to wander, to explore, to risk something that didn't have a calculable return. I thought I was being rigorous. I was being afraid. There's a difference, and it matters enormously, and most high-achieving people never stop long enough to feel it. Rigor in service of a genuine vision is expansive. It opens more doors than it closes. But discipline deployed as a defense mechanism doesn't build a life. It fortifies a perimeter. And eventually, the perimeter becomes the only thing you know how to manage. I remember a moment, a specific moment, because the body remembers what the mind prefers to rationalize away. When an opportunity arrived, not a financial opportunity, a human one. A person who saw me with a clarity I wasn't prepared for, and offered something that couldn't be quantified. And I remember the calculation that happened. Not emotional, not instinctive, calculated, systematic, threat assessment, resource allocation, risk management of the heart. And I walked away, not because it wasn't right, but because I had built systems so sophisticated that I had automated the rejection of anything that didn't fit the architecture. The cage didn't just hold me in. It filtered out everything that might have changed me. Here's the uncomfortable thing about highly sophisticated people. Their sophistication is often a weapon turned inward. The same intelligence that builds great companies or great portfolios can be deployed to build an airtight justification for every fear. The mind that's good at solving problems is equally good at framing vulnerability as a problem to be solved, and then solving it by eliminating the vulnerability. Which means the smartest, most capable, most disciplined people are often the most imprisoned. Not despite their strengths. Because of them. Can you tell whether you're being mature or just afraid to want something fully? The bars are not visible because they're built from values, real values, good values, hard work, prudence, self-reliance, responsibility. These are not lies. They are genuine goods that have been over-applied, weaponized into a system of containment so thorough that the man inside it has started to believe the container is his natural size. I had made myself small in the name of being disciplined. I had made myself unavailable in the name of being focused. I had made myself unreachable in the name of being strong. And the worst part, the part I'm still sitting with, even now, is that nobody forced this on me. Not entirely. Yes, there were early experiences that planted the seeds. Yes, there were messages I absorbed about what strength was and what weakness meant. But the construction? The decade of careful voluntary construction? That was mine, which means the demolition has to be mine too. And demolition is a different kind of work than building. Building gives you something to show, progress, milestones, results. Demolition just gives you rubble. And you have to be willing to stand in the rubble without immediately replacing it with the next structure. To just be in the open, unprotected, disoriented space for long enough to feel what you've actually been protecting against. That space is terrifying. I am not going to pretend otherwise. But I can tell you something about it. Something I could not have told you before I stepped into it. Something that changes the whole calculus of risk, of investment, of what you're actually trying to build with your one specific, unrepeatable life. What I found in the rubble wasn't emptiness. It was something I'd been spending extraordinary resources to prevent myself from finding. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for what it meant. The moment I finally understood freedom had nothing to do with money. I was sitting in a parking lot at 7 a.m, eating a meal I'd bought from a drive-thru, listening to rain on the windshield. Not a glamorous awakening. Not the kind of moment that would make a good photograph. No mountain view. No dramatic decision. No cinematic backdrop. Just rain. And the sound of my own breathing. And the sudden, absolute certainty that I had been wrong about almost everything that mattered. Not wrong about the work. Not wrong about the discipline or the strategy or the fundamentals. Wrong about the why. Wrong about what I was building toward and for whom I was building it and what I expected it to do to the thing inside me that had been aching for as long as I could remember. Freedom is not the absence of constraint. I know that now in a way I cannot unknow. Real freedom is the presence of choice that comes from knowing yourself well enough to know what you actually want. Not what fear wants, not what the wound wants, not what the version of you that formed under pressure decided you needed to prove. What you want. From the deepest, most honest, most uncalculating part of yourself. That knowing doesn't come from accumulation. It comes from excavation. And excavation is painful, unglamorous, often embarrassing work. Because what you find when you go deep enough is not a hero. It's not the powerful self-made narrative you've been presenting to the world. What you find is a person. Just a person. With fears that are sometimes irrational and needs that are sometimes simple and a longing for connection so fundamental, it predates every sophisticated structure you've built on top of it. I found that person in a parking lot in the rain, eating fast food, completely alone. And for the first time in years, not running from the aloneness, just sitting in it, letting it be what it was. That was the door unlocking. Not a dramatic moment, not a revelation handed down from something larger than myself. Just the simple, devastating act of stopping. Of not optimizing the moment, or extracting value from it, or turning it into a lesson I could deploy later. Just being a person in a parking lot in the rain who had made a lot of money and a lot of mistakes, and was finally willing to stop pretending the mistakes hadn't cost something real. The relationship with money changes. Not the strategy, the relationship. You stop using it as proof of your worth, and start using it as a tool for the life you're actually trying to build. The decisions become cleaner. The risk tolerance becomes more honest. Because you're no longer managing your portfolio around the psychological needs of a wound, you're making choices from something steadier, something that doesn't need to be validated by a quarterly return. You start investing differently. Not just financially. You start investing in relationships that require you to be seen, in experiences that require you to be present, in work that requires you to actually care about the outcome, not just the metric. The diversification starts to look different because your definition of return has expanded. And the fear, this is the part I want you to hold on to, the fear doesn't disappear. Anyone who tells you the goal is to eliminate fear is selling you a simpler story than the one you're actually living. Fear stays, but it stops running the operation. It becomes information rather than instruction. It tells you something is important, something is at stake, something deserves your full attention, and then you get to decide what to do with that, rather than letting the fear decide for you. That shift, from fear as instruction to fear as information, is the most valuable reframe I have ever made. It cost nothing, and it changed everything. I want to ask you something, and I want you to genuinely answer it, even if just to yourself. What would you do differently, tomorrow, if you knew that the outcome you're most afraid of would be survivable? Not comfortable, not painless, but survivable. Because it would be. I can tell you that from the inside. Whatever the number in your chest, whatever the floor you're terrified to fall through, on the other side of it is not the end. On the other side is just more life, which turns out to be the only thing that was ever actually available. I am still building. But I'm building something different now. Something smaller in some ways. Something far more specific. Something that when I look at it on the worst days, still looks like mine. The door was never locked from the outside. It was never locked at all. I had just stopped reaching for the handle.